The helicopter descended through a curtain of gray clouds, and for the first time in 11 years, Richard Harlow looked down at Ashford Manor, the sprawling estate perched at the edge of Willowbrook Valley, where he had buried his heart alongside the woman he had loved more than breath itself. From the air, the old stone mansion looked smaller than he remembered, swallowed by ivy and the wild ambition of untrimmed oaks that had stretched toward the sky in his absence. Richard pressed his palm against the cold glass of the window and exhaled slowly, the kind of breath a man releases when he has been holding it for over a decade. He had not planned to come back. That had always been the arrangement he made with himself, a silent, ironclad contract forged in the ash of grief. But business had dragged him here. His real estate firm had acquired a development portfolio that included the surrounding valley lands, and his attorneys had flagged the manor itself, still legally in his name, as an asset that needed to be assessed, catalogued, and liquidated. Richard had signed the initial paperwork with a steady hand, told his assistant to schedule a site visit, and convinced himself it was purely transactional. That was what billionaires did. They reduced emotion to line items and moved forward. But sitting in that helicopter, watching the roofline of Ashford Manor emerge from the fog, Richard Harlow knew there was nothing transactional about this visit. He was 54 years old, with silver threading through his dark hair and the permanent architecture of loss carved beneath his eyes. He had built an empire worth $3 billion since leaving this valley. He had shaken hands with presidents, dined with royalty, and spoken at conferences where the world's most powerful men leaned forward to catch his words. And yet none of it, not a single glittering achievement, had ever filled the hollow space that had opened in his chest the morning his wife, Elena, was buried in the cold November ground. Elena Harlow. Beautiful, ferocious, warm Elena. She had died in a car accident on a rainy Tuesday when their son, Marcus, was barely 3 years old. The car had gone off the bridge at Miller's Crossing, plunging into the river below. The official report said she died on impact. Richard had identified her body in the county morgue, and something inside him had shattered so completely that no amount of money could buy enough pieces to put it back together. He had left Willowbrook that same week, taking nothing but his grief and his infant son, who was now cared for by a nanny in London while Richard conquered the world in penance. The helicopter touched down on the overgrown lawn. The pilot cut the engine. Richard stepped out into the cool morning air, and the smell of damp earth and old roses hit him like a fist. He straightened his coat, adjusted his cufflinks, and faced the iron front door of Ashford Manor. That was when he saw the light in the window. A man who has spent years engineering certainty does not know what to do with a flicker of the impossible. Richard stood motionless on the gravel path, his eyes fixed on the amber glow spilling through the tall ground floor window, the one that looked directly into the kitchen. He blinked, certain the fog was playing tricks. But the light held steady and warm, the unmistakable signature of a kitchen lamp burning against the gray morning. His security detail, 2 men named Price and Callahan who had accompanied him from London, moved to flank him instinctively. Price's hand drifted toward the inside of his jacket, and Richard raised a single finger, a quiet command for stillness. This was his manor, his ground. Whatever waited inside, he would meet it on his own terms. He walked forward, his polished shoes crunching lightly across the gravel, and placed his hand against the great iron door knocker. He did not knock. Instead, he pushed. The door swung inward with a groan of old hinges, releasing the scent of beeswax polish, fresh bread, and wood smoke. Richard stepped into the entrance hall and was immediately confronted by the impossible contradiction between the ruin he had expected and the home he found. The marble floors had been swept. The carved oak banister gleamed. Fresh wildflowers, purple lavender and white meadowsweet, stood in a stone vase on the hall table. A child's coat hung on the row of iron hooks beside the door. Small, red. The coat of a boy no older than 7 or 8. Richard's chest tightened. He moved down the corridor toward the kitchen and could now hear sounds, the soft percussion of a knife on a cutting board, the low hum of a woman singing to herself, a tune so faint it existed at the very edge of hearing. He paused at the kitchen doorway and pressed his hand against the frame to steady himself. Then he looked through the door, and the world stopped. She was standing at the kitchen counter with her back to him, dark hair twisted loosely at the nape of her neck, wearing a cream-colored blouse. Her shoulders moved rhythmically as she cut vegetables, and the humming grew clearer. It was the same melody she used to hum on Sunday mornings when she made breakfast in this very kitchen 11 years ago. Richard's vision blurred. His knees threatened to give. The woman at the counter turned slightly, and the profile of her face, the sharp cheekbone, the soft jaw, the full lower lip, sent a tremor through every nerve in his body. "Elena," he whispered. The knife clattered onto the counter. The woman spun around, and Richard Harlow saw the face of his dead wife staring back at him with eyes wide, in absolute terror. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. The kitchen hummed with the small, oblivious sounds of a domestic morning, the pop of embers in the hearth, the tick of the old clock above the door, the distant call of a wood pigeon beyond the window. The woman pressed her back against the counter, both hands gripping the edge, and stared at Richard as if she were watching a wall collapse. Richard stared back, his mind doing the desperate, futile work of reconciling what his eyes showed him with what his memory held as fact. He had identified her body. He had held her cold hand in the morgue. He had watched her coffin descend into the ground. He had built 11 years of misery on the bedrock certainty that Elena Harlow was dead. And yet here she stood, warm and breathing, color rising in her cheeks, chest heaving with unmistakable, infuriating life. "Richard." Her voice came out hoarse, fractured, barely more than his name. But it was her voice. Undeniably, impossibly hers. "You're dead." The words came out of him without design, stripped of everything except blunt disbelief. She shook her head slowly, and he watched something complex and painful move across her face: guilt, fear, grief, and something else he could not yet name. She moved her mouth as though forming words she could not release, and Richard felt the first seismic tremor of something shifting beneath his grief. Not relief, not joy. Something colder and sharper. The first, distant thunder of betrayal. "Sit down," she said at last, steadying her voice with visible effort. "Please, Richard. Sit down, and I will explain everything." "You will explain," he laughed, and even to his own ears it sounded like breaking glass. "You will explain why you're alive. Why I buried you. Why my son grew up without a mother." He stepped into the kitchen, and she flinched, not with the reflex of a guilty woman, but with the deep-wired instinct of someone who had been afraid for a very long time. That flinch stopped him. He pulled out a chair and sat down heavily at the old oak kitchen table. She moved to the opposite side and sat down too, clasping her hands before her. It was the same gesture she had always made when she had something difficult to say, and Richard felt the full, staggering weight of what was happening. His dead wife was sitting across the kitchen table from him. The morning light fell across her face, and he could see the traces of what 11 years had written there, the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the quiet exhaustion behind them. She was real. She was here. And she was terrified of what she was about to say. From somewhere upstairs, the unmistakable sound of a child's footsteps crossed the floor above them, and both Richard and Elena looked up at the ceiling. Richard looked back at her slowly. "Is that Marcus?" he asked. She shook her head, and Richard felt the ground beneath him shift again. "His name is Daniel," Elena said quietly. She watched Richard's face as she said it, watched the way the name landed in him like a stone into deep water, sending ripples outward in every direction. She kept her hands clasped together on the table, white-knuckled and still, because the alternative was letting him see how badly they were trembling. Richard said nothing for a long moment. He looked at the ceiling again as though he could see through it, as though he could read the story of the last 11 years written into the plaster above them. Then he looked back at Elena, and his expression was something she had never seen on his face before, a careful, deliberate blankness that she recognized as the mask he wore when he was trying not to feel something that was too large for the room. "How old?" he asked.
10, she said.
The arithmetic was simple and brutal. Richard did it in seconds, and she saw him do it. He had been gone for 11 years. Daniel was 10 years old. She watched him understand. "He's not mine," Richard said. It was not a question. "No," Elena said. "He is not yours." Another silence. The fire clicked. Upstairs, Daniel's footsteps moved again. The small, confident sounds of a boy who had grown up in this house and had never known any other kind of morning. Elena thought of how he would come downstairs soon, drawn by the smell of breakfast, his dark hair still messy from sleep, full of uncomplicated morning happiness. She had to get through this conversation before that happened. She had to give Richard enough of the truth to hold him in place before the whole architecture of her deception collapsed around all of them. "I need you to understand," she began carefully, "that I did not disappear because I wanted to. I disappeared because I had no other choice." Richard's jaw tightened. "That is the kind of sentence," he said, very quietly, "that a person says when they want to avoid being held responsible for what they actually did." "I know how it sounds." She met his eyes directly, forcing herself not to look away. "I know that there is nothing I can say in the next few minutes that will make this feel like anything other than a profound betrayal. But I am asking you to hear me before you decide what it is." She drew a slow breath. 11 years ago, 2 weeks before the accident, before what everyone was told was an accident, I received a threat. Not a vague threat. A specific, credible threat against my life and yours, delivered by men who worked for Viktor Sorokin. The name visibly registered. Richard's eyes sharpened. Viktor Sorokin was not a name from Elena's world. He was a name from Richard's. From the very early days before the billions, when Richard Harlow had done business in parts of the world that did not appear in any official biography. Elena had never spoken that name aloud in their marriage, had swallowed the knowledge of it for years, but she spoke it now like a key turning in a lock. "They told me," Elena continued, "that if I did not disappear, completely and permanently, they would kill you. And Marcus. And me. They had photographs. They had information. They had reach." She paused. "I chose to die so that you could live." Upstairs, Daniel called out, "Mom? Is breakfast ready?" Richard had not heard the name Viktor Sorokin spoken aloud in over 20 years. It belonged to a chapter of his life that he had sealed, buried, and paved over with success, the way wealthy men often bury the darker roads that carried them to their fortunes. Hearing it now, in this kitchen, from the lips of his dead wife, produced a very specific and unpleasant sensation in his chest. The realization of a man who discovers that the past he thought he had escaped has simply been waiting, patient and unimpressed, for him to circle back to it. Elena had sent Daniel back upstairs with a plate of toast and a firm instruction to wash his face, and the boy had gone, casting one brief, curious glance at the strange man sitting at his kitchen table before disappearing up the stairs. Richard had looked at the boy only for a second, but a second was enough to confirm that Daniel shared nothing of his features. The child was dark-eyed and fine-boned, with a quiet watchfulness that reminded Richard, uncomfortably, of someone he could not immediately place. Now Elena laid out the rest of the story with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed it many times, always knowing this conversation was inevitable and always dreading its shape. Viktor Sorokin, she explained, had been one of Richard's early investors, a shadowy intermediary who had provided seed capital for Harlow's first international acquisition when Richard was 28 and not yet particular about the provenance of his backing. It had been a single transaction, a loan that Richard had repaid within 3 years, and, he had believed, had convinced himself that the connection was severed. But Sorokin was not a man who accepted the conclusion of a debt. He viewed it as the beginning of an obligation, and when Richard's business empire began to overlap with Sorokin's interests in Eastern European infrastructure, Sorokin had begun making quiet, persistent attempts to extract further cooperation. Richard had refused. He had hired lawyers, restructured the relevant companies, and installed a wall of legal architecture between himself and any trace of the old connection. He had believed for almost a decade that it had worked. What he had not known, what Elena now told him, was that Sorokin's people had been watching their family throughout. They had been patient. They had been gathering. And when Richard's refusals became too expensive, they moved against the most effective leverage available. Elena. A threat had been delivered through an intermediary directly to her, with evidence of surveillance proving they could reach her anywhere, at any time. The message was simple: disappear, or everyone you love will be removed far less gently. Elena had contacted a former intelligence contact she trusted, a woman named Adler, and together they had engineered the accident at Miller's Crossing. A body recovered from the river. A closed casket identification. A new identity waiting in a safe house 3 countries away. "I watched your grief from a distance," Elena said, and her voice cracked for the first time. "I watched you leave this house. I watched you take Marcus and disappear into your own exile. And I told myself it was the only way. That you were alive. That Marcus was alive." She looked down at her hands. "I came back here 4 years ago because Sorokin died. His organization collapsed. The threat dissolved. And I had nowhere else in the world that felt like something I had any right to return to." Richard was silent for a very long time. "The body in the morgue," he said at last. "Whose body was it?" Elena met his eyes. "An unidentified woman who had died the previous night. A casualty of Sorokin's own operations who would never be claimed. Adler arranged it." She held his gaze. Richard stood up from the table slowly and walked to the kitchen window, staring out at the fog-wrapped garden. His back was to Elena, and she could not read him. She had never, in all their years together, been unable to read him. That distance, that opaque, turned back, told her more than his face could have. "You let me grieve you for 11 years, he said to the window. "Yes," she said. "You let our son grow up believing his mother was dead." The words hit her like a physical blow. "Yes," she said again, because there was no other word available. The phone call to London was brief and devastating in its efficiency. Richard spoke to his assistant, then to Marcus's nanny, then, after a pause that lasted nearly a full minute of silence, to his son. Marcus Harlow was 14 years old, lean and serious, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn jaw. He attended a private school in Kensington where he was considered quiet, exceptionally bright, and slightly remote, the last quality being the one that Richard recognized as his own inheritance to his son, the emotional distance that grief teaches its children. Richard stood in the entrance hall and told Marcus, in the measured and careful voice of a man dismantling a bomb, that he needed him to come to Ashford Manor immediately. That there was something important he needed to see. That Richard would explain everything. When he arrived, Marcus, who had learned long ago not to press his father during moments of controlled calm, said only, "All right, Dad." And the call ended. Elena had stayed in the kitchen. She heard him making calls, heard the low register of his voice through the walls, and sat at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long gone cold. Daniel came back downstairs eventually, sensed the weight in the house with the acute emotional radar of children, and settled at the table across from her with a book, reading quietly without asking questions. She watched her son read and felt the strange doubling of her heart that motherhood had become. Daniel, who was hers entirely, and Marcus, who was hers and Richard's, and whom she had abandoned to the fiction of her death when he was 3 years old, too young to carry a memory of her face. Marcus had no memory of Elena. He had only photographs, however many Richard had kept or discarded, and the abstract narrative of a mother who had died when he was very small. 11 years ago, Elena had told herself that was a mercy, that a child who could not remember could not properly mourn. She understood now, with the clarity that only time and honesty can provide, that she had told herself a convenient lie. The absence of a mother is not softened by the absence of memory. It becomes its own architecture, a room in the house of a child's identity where the door is permanently locked. Richard came back into the kitchen in the early afternoon and looked at Daniel with the careful, neutral expression he had been deploying all morning. Daniel looked up from his book and regarded the stranger with calm, dark eyes. There was no resemblance between them, but there was something in the boy's composure, some quality of stillness and watchfulness, that registered in Richard as strangely familiar. He could not account for it. "He knows?" Richard asked Elena quietly. "He knows his father is not in our lives," Elena said carefully. "He has never asked more than that." Richard looked at her steadily. Who is his father? Elena met his gaze. His name was James Adler, she said. He was the son of the woman who helped me disappear. He died 3 years ago. A real accident, this time. Her voice remained level, but her eyes moved briefly to Daniel, then back. Daniel does not know the details. Richard said nothing. He walked to the window again, his habitual retreat, and looked out at the garden where Marcus would arrive within a few hours, and the last intact wall of the life Richard had built on his wife's death would finally come down. Marcus arrived at Ashford Manor at 4:30 in the afternoon, delivered by a hired car from the nearest train station, and Richard met him on the front steps. The boy stepped out of the car with his overnight bag slung over one shoulder, looked up at the old manor with the frank curiosity of a teenager encountering a piece of his history for the first time, and then looked at his father. Something in Richard's face, some quality of compressed, barely contained upheaval, made Marcus go still. "Dad," he said cautiously. "What's happening?" Richard put a hand on his son's shoulder. "Come inside," he said. "There is someone here you need to meet." He had spoken to Elena while Marcus was en route, and they had agreed, or rather, Richard had stated and Elena had accepted, that the introduction would be handled with complete honesty and no further protective untruths. The mechanisms of concealment had already extracted 11 years of damage. Richard had no appetite for further softening of facts. Elena was standing in the drawing room when they entered. She had changed her blouse and brushed her hair, and Richard noticed, with an abstract and distant kind of pain, that she had put on the pearl earrings she had been wearing in their wedding photograph. He did not know if that was deliberate or unconscious, but it struck him as significant in a way he lacked the emotional vocabulary to articulate. Marcus stopped in the doorway. He looked at the woman standing by the fireplace. He had seen photographs somewhere at some point, but photographs of the dead carry a particular quality of finality that removes them from the category of the real. What he saw now was a living, breathing woman who looked at him with an expression of such layered, raw emotion that it was almost unbearable to witness. "Marcus," Elena said. Her voice broke cleanly on the single syllable of his name. The boy stood frozen for a long moment. Then he turned to his father. "Is this—" he couldn't finish. "Yes," Richard said. Marcus turned back to Elena. Several things moved across his face in rapid succession. Disbelief, confusion, a flash of something that might have been anger, and then, breaking through all of it with the unstoppable force of a truth a 14-year-old body recognizes before the mind catches up, a grief so sudden and complete that it erased everything else. His face crumpled. He made a sound Richard had never heard from him, not a cry exactly, but something deeper, something from the structural foundations of a child who had spent his entire life building his identity around an absence, and who was now being told the absence was a lie. Elena crossed the room in 4 steps and wrapped her arms around her son, and Marcus, despite everything, despite the betrayal, despite the impossibility, held on to her with both hands and wept. Richard stood at the doorway and watched his son weep in the arms of his dead wife, and he did something he had not done in 11 years. He pressed his hand over his own eyes and allowed himself, in the privacy of that moment, to break entirely. They sat together in the drawing room as the evening came in, and the fire was built up, and Daniel was put to bed by Elena with the quiet efficiency of a practiced mother, a performance of normalcy that seemed almost surreal against the emotional wreckage distributed among the rest of them. Richard poured whiskey. He did not drink. Marcus sat on the settee with his arms crossed and his eyes red, moving through the stages of emotional processing with the accelerated intensity of the young. The questions came slowly at first, then in a rush. Marcus wanted to know everything: the accident, Sorokin, Adler, the years in between. Elena answered each one honestly, without evasion, holding his gaze even when the answers made him flinch. She was, Richard observed, a more honest version of herself than the woman he had married, as if the years of carrying the deception had stripped away whatever softness she had once used to smooth difficult truths. She told their son the hard facts with the directness of someone who understood, finally and completely, what protecting people from truth actually cost them. Richard listened, without speaking. He was performing his own interior inventory, a cold, systematic accounting of what he felt versus what he was expected to feel, the kind of exercise that a man who had spent 11 years converting grief into business strategy had become very efficient at. He was angry, yes, a deep, structural anger that he recognized would take a long time to fully map. He was also something he had no immediate word for, a sensation like a bandage being removed from a wound that had healed wrong, painful and necessary, and disorienting all at once. He thought about the years, the specific texture of the years. He thought about Marcus at 4 years old, asking his nanny why other children had mothers and he did not. He thought about himself at 40, sitting alone in his London office on what would have been his and Elena's wedding anniversary, working until midnight because work was the only container large enough to hold what he was carrying. He thought about the deals he had made, the coldness he had cultivated, the way he had turned loss into leverage so efficiently that he had sometimes gone whole weeks without feeling anything at all. He thought about the cost of that, the relational cost, the human cost, the cost he was only now beginning to count properly. "What do you want?" Marcus asked Elena at last, with the direct, unflinching challenge of a teenager who had decided that softness was not available to him right now. Elena looked at her son. "I want nothing from you that you are not willing to give," she said. "I came back here because this was the only place I had any connection to anymore. I didn't expect your father to come. I didn't expect any of this." She looked briefly at Richard, then back at Marcus. "What I hope for, not what I expect, is time. The chance to be present. To be your mother in some form that doesn't require you to pretend the last 11 years didn't happen." Marcus looked at his hands for a long moment. Then he looked at his father. "What do you want, Dad?" Richard had been asking himself that question since the moment he stepped into the kitchen and the ground disappeared beneath him. What did he want? The answer was more complicated than it had any right to be. He was furious. He was devastated. He was, in some sealed chamber of himself, staggered with relief that she was alive. All of it was true simultaneously, and none of it resolved into anything clean. "I want the truth," he said. "All of it. And then I want time to decide what I do with it." They stayed at Ashford Manor for 3 days. It was not a decision that was explicitly made. It was simply what happened, the way certain consequential events happen, not through choice but through the quiet logic of circumstances that have finally found their necessary conclusion. Price and Callahan slept in the staff quarters. Richard's London meetings were postponed. Marcus missed 3 days of school. Daniel moved through it all with the serene adaptability of a child who had grown up in unusual circumstances and learned to treat strangeness as routine. On the second morning, Richard walked the grounds alone. The gardens had been kept, not professionally, but with the stubborn, personal care of someone who understood what a garden meant to the people who had planted it. The rose beds that Elena had put in during their first spring in the house were still there, overgrown but alive, the canes thick as rope and sprawling magnificently beyond any trellis's ambitions. The kitchen garden had been expanded. Her beds ran along the south wall. A vegetable plot occupied the old croquet lawn, practical and generous, the garden of a woman who had learned to live rather than merely survive. He found himself standing at the edge of the garden's farthest boundary, looking out across the valley below, at the fields and the woods and the distant glint of the river, the same river at whose bridge they had drowned Elena Harlow and given birth to whatever she had become in the year since. He stood there for a long time, and what came to him slowly was not the grief he expected, but something more complicated, a retrospective understanding of the shape of his adult life, viewed from a new angle. He had become who he was because of her absence. The empire, the coldness, the relentless productive machinery of Harlow International, all of it had been constructed on the scaffolding of loss. Without Elena's death to drive him, he could not be certain he would have built the same life. He was not sure, standing in that cold morning air, whether that life was one he was proud of. Success, he was beginning to understand, could be a very elaborate form of running away. On the second afternoon, Elena found him in the library, the room where he had proposed to her, on a cold December evening 20 years ago, pulling a ring from his jacket pocket with shaking hands while she sat in the chair by the fire pretending not to know what was coming. The library smelled the same as it always had: old paper, beeswax, wood smoke. The same chair was still by the fire. He was standing in front of the shelves, running his fingers along the spines of books with a faraway expression. "I kept them," she said from the doorway. "The books. I dusted them every month."
He turned.
They looked at each other across the room with the particular silence of two people who have said everything important and are waiting to discover what remains. "Why this house?" he asked. "Of all the places you could have gone, why come back here?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because this is where I was happiest," she said. "And I had been away from happiness long enough." A pause. "I know I had no right to it. This house is yours. I had no right to return and make it a home without asking you." "You're right," he said. "You didn't." Another pause. "And yet." He turned back to the shelves. "It looks better than when I left it." The words were not forgiveness. They were not absolution. But they were something, a crack of light under the door of a room that had been sealed for 11 years, and in that light Elena found something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. The small, stubborn beginning of hope. On the morning of the fourth day, Richard sat down at the old oak kitchen table, the same table at which he had first seen her face, first heard her voice, first felt the world reorganize itself around a truth too large to hold, and placed a manila folder between them. Elena looked at it without touching it. Daniel had been sent to play in the garden. Marcus sat at the head of the table, having refused, with quiet adolescent firmness, to be excluded from whatever was about to happen. Richard opened the folder. Inside was a document, a legal summary prepared overnight by his solicitors at his telephoned instruction, for pages of measured, professional language outlining the nature of a trust and residence agreement. He had been awake until 3 a.m, and his eyes showed it. But his voice was level. "Ashford Manor will remain in my name for now," he said. "But this document establishes a legal, binding agreement that grants you and Daniel the right to continue living here for as long as you choose." He paused. "I am not ready to forgive you, Elena.
I want to be direct about that.
What you did cost me, and cost Marcus, in ways I have not yet finished calculating. The anger is real, and it will take time." Elena nodded. She did not argue. "But you are alive," Richard continued. "And Marcus has a mother. And, however I arrived at those facts, they are facts. I choose to work with facts rather than against them." He looked at his son. Marcus was watching him with the careful, evaluating eyes of a boy who had learned to read the feelings that leaked around the edges of his father's composure. Marcus gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement, not an absolution. Richard looked back at Elena. "What happened with Sorokin, the threat, the reasons you made the choices you made, I will have investigated independently. Thoroughly. Not because I doubt you entirely, but because I no longer take anything entirely on faith." A pause. "If the investigation confirms what you've said, then the conversation about what comes next becomes possible. And if it doesn't?" Elena asked. "Then we have a different conversation," he said simply. "But I don't think we will." He closed the folder and pushed it across to her. "Sign it. Keep the house. Raise your son. Let Marcus find his own way to whatever relationship he's capable of having with you." He stood. "I will come back. Not because I've decided what I feel. I haven't. But because I have spent 11 years staying away from things that mattered, and I'm done with that now." He picked up his coat from the back of the chair. Marcus rose too, and the two of them stood side by side, father and son, similar in the stubborn set of their jaws, similar in the guarded light behind their eyes, and looked at Elena. She looked back at them and felt something unlock in her chest that she had been keeping sealed for over a decade, the specific, irreplaceable feeling of being part of something that was broken but not lost. "I'll walk you to the car," Marcus said to his father. They went out through the front door together, and Elena remained at the table, the folder before her, the morning light coming warm through the kitchen window. She could hear them on the gravel path outside, two voices, low and unhurried, the beginnings of a conversation between a father and son who were learning, slowly, the language of honesty. She placed her hand flat on the folder. Outside in the garden, Daniel's laughter rose above the sound of the wind in the old oak trees. The manor creaked around her, settled and patient, and full of the kind of quiet that follows long storms. Elena Harlow, who had been dead and was now alive, who had been gone and was now returned, who had been a lie and was now finally, painfully, a fact, picked up the pen from the table. And for the first time in 11 years, she signed her own name.